and welcome to another Traxion interview. Following the news that Motorsport Games has acquired KartKraft, we thought we'd speak to the Director of Studio for the newly formed Motorsport Games Australia, Zach Griffin. Zach, how are you?
I'm fantastic, and thanks for having me, Tom.
Yeah, no worries. So we thought we'd just have a quick chat together to discuss, obviously, the recent sort of acquisition news, but then also just generally the origin story, so to speak, of KartKraft and what maybe the roadmap is for the future, if that's okay. So
Absolutely.
I think let's just dive in. And could you tell me where KartKraft, the idea came from? Did you love karting yourself, and how it was formed in the beginning, please?
Yeah, for sure. So I think I ended up going to my very first Grand Prix back in about 1996 with my dad, and
Nice.
in Melbourne to the Formula One, and started watching every race ever since that. Started playing Jeff Cramman's Grand Prix games, had a big love of racing ever since then, and that gradually extended as I played more and more games. And once I had the money to start racing, I bought myself a go-kart when I was 18, and started racing competitively, at least in Australia.
Right.
And then obviously that turned into something a little bit more serious, and was racing virtually every first and the second weekend of the month, and that just grew and grew.
That's not a cheap passion. Is that fair to say?
No, it's certainly not, and it's one that as a uni student at the time, I think all my money went towards that, and tyres and engine rebuilds, and certainly not a cheap sport, but certainly the most affordable of all the motorsport categories there are.
Yeah. So how did that transition into creating a video game about, or a simulator about, your passion?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I was playing Jeff Cramman's Grand Prix games, and then played the F1 2000 games by ISI back at the time, and EA Sports, and that was always I think I was into gaming from a young age, and I'd always wanted to get into the gaming industry, and I think my first wish would have been to do a Formula One game, but obviously without the license, that wasn't a possibility.
It's tricky.
So absolutely, and karting, I think for most people, when they associate karting and their understanding of it, is that it's an indoor karting, where it's most people's experience with that. And then if you look at professional karting, which is where Formula One drivers started, like your Sebastian Vettels, Lando Norris, and those guys, you can really start to see just how serious karting is and how great the racing is. And that's why you see those F1 drivers come back to the racetracks in off seasons, in between races, one, to keep their skills sharp, and then secondly, because it's just such a great sport, and the racing, I think, is second to none. Yeah.
So for the uninitiated, I'd like to sort of briefly explain what KartKraft is and what it represents. So let's say, what's the elevator pitch?
So KartKraft essentially lets you race these purpose-built racing machines with 30 horsepower that allow you to do speeds of 0 to 60 in 3 to 3.5 seconds, and pulling 2.5 to 3G around corners. And to give you some context, a road car typically be pulling about 0.5 to 0.8 G at absolute maximum. So it puts you in that seat. It lets you race 30 other karts about a centimetre off the ground. There's certainly nothing as thrilling as go-kart racing, particularly if you've seen it live.
Yeah. And so, just to clarify, these karts are very different to the ones that I've experienced personally with my friends that are an indoor karting arena. And most sort of mere mortals like myself can't just jump into these. You've got to work up to them and have in-depth skills. So I guess KartKraft enables me to experience something that I'm not normally able to do in real life.
Yeah, for sure. I think for most people, being able to race an indoor kart is the closest that they'd get to racing something like that. And typically with indoor karts, you're talking 6.5 horsepower and maximum speeds of let's say 70 kilometers an hour, whereas this one, it's in the faster classes, it's 160 kilometers an hour, or 60 to 80 mile an hour.
Which must feel like a million when you sat solo down to the ground.
Absolutely. You've got the tarmac flying past you, and it's only experience like no other. And KartKraft is the very first sort of dedicated karting game of the modern era that puts you into the seat and allows you to feel exactly what it's like racing these machines on laser scan tracks. So whatever you're seeing in the tracks in real life, it's exactly the same in the simulator.
Yeah. So how do you go about translating that feeling of the sensation of driving those incredible karts to a video game? I'm assuming that you would lean upon your own personal experiences quite heavily.
Yeah, definitely. And as I said earlier, I was racing go-karts competitively for a number of years and racing the Formula 100, which is one of the faster categories out there. And it's certainly something I rely on, as well as the test days that I've done in the recent past to get that feeling and try and bring that feeling onto the screen, which is certainly not an easy task, but one I think we've done a very good job at doing, and that's playing with the cameras and making sure the camera feels and translate that sense of speed all the way through to the driver's animation. So you see them going around the corner, you can actually see horses pushing their body and their necks into the seat, and one that conveys that sense of speed that karting has.
Yeah, playing KartKraft, for me, there's a couple of areas which really help with bringing that feeling and that feedback, or that sense of speed, and also the muscles required to sort of force the kart around the corner, but with minimal tiny movements and adjustments. You must have to build up all new shoulder and arm muscles there. So the first thing that really hit me was how well the force feedback on the steering wheel comes across. So could you enlighten us, what's the process behind there? How much fine tuning has gone into that setup? Because to me, it feels spot on.
Yeah, definitely. It wasn't a short road to get there, and it's certainly the result of many iterations and listening to our players and our community, who are certainly very vocal, but in a great way. So what you're seeing there and what you're feeling is the direct forces calculated from the tire and the contact patch all the way through the kinematics of the steering. And so we don't believe in faking any forces or generating any pre-canned effects that you might see in more arcade titles. So you're experiencing the most real and tactile forces coming through the steering column, calculate exactly as you'd feel them in real life. Yeah,
and another thing that really brings home a sense of realism is for anyone who has a decent PC and also the VR headset, and playing this game with that incredible force feedback and in VR is something that's really, really different. I know other games do VR and other games do have really good handling models and tire models, but this sort of puts it all together. So could you talk about why you decided to put VR into the game and how much effort's gone into that as well?
Yeah, definitely. So the VR, we initially had one of the DK2, which is, for those who don't know, the second development kit iteration of the Oculus Rift, as it's known today. And so we're very early adopters of that. And for those who haven't tried it, KartKraft is probably one of the better racing titles out there to experience VR for the first time. You're so low to the ground, you're not in an enclosed space. You can see the tarmac rushing through directly under your kart, and as I said before, you're a centimetre from the ground. So that again translates into a very visceral feeling where you typically wouldn't get that because you've got doors and you've got netting and you've got your A-pillars in front of you, whereas KartKraft, you're completely unoccluded. You can see everything. It's experience like nothing else. Yeah,
I think that's the key takeaway from when you first play the game is, and once you do the first few laps without spinning, this is unlike any other game or sim out there at the minute. And on that point, I feel like karting is sort of underrepresented in the space. My personal interpretation of karting is that there's not a lot out there. But why do you think that is?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree. If you look at karting and chassis and how karts actually drive, they corner on three wheels. There's no differential. There's no suspension. When you're turning the kart, they've got such large degrees of cast so that you only need to turn the wheel 5 degrees to corner. And this typically presents quite significant challenges to actually work out how a kart handles, what the forces and the handling dynamics are that that allow them to corner on 3 wheels and brake with rear brakes only and not spin out. And so typically the literature is quite limited because it's not an area where typically universities focus their research. And so we've spent many, many years actually trying to understand how a kart handles, why it behaves the way it does, and how they actually start on and stay on the track and grip.
Yeah.
And so we've spent significant time actually honing that physics model and understanding how the chassis flexes into what until now really no one else has been able to reproduce with any sort of great deal of accuracy.
Yeah, that's great. So you mentioned there that it's quite unique, that presents its own challenges, and you have to do your own sort of research, and the game feels great. So how many years do you think it's been from that initial idea to where we are today?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't like to count too many of them, but I was working on the prototype, when I first started karting, and also did a few other projects in between. The computing power, really, it's only in the last few years that we've been able to run the simulation and actually simulate the chassis flex because of that computing power. So we started the studio formally in 2015. We released KartKraft in 2018 in November. It's been very well received, but it certainly hasn't been a short development period.
Even if it's a long road, as long as the vision is finally realised at the end, it'll all be worth it. Speaking of which, so the game is still currently in early access on Steam, on PC, if that's correct. So could you tell me about why early access and how has that process been for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think early access afforded us the ability as a smaller studio to launch in a kinder environment, typically, where there wasn't that expectation, at least that you'd expect from a AAA game. And so we've worked closely with our fans since we launched to, one, get their feedback and then work out how we can incorporate their feedback into the game to make KartKraft a better experience. One, for hardcore players, and secondly, for those people who have never driven a kart before and don't know what to expect, and making it a more accessible experience for them.
Yeah, actually, on accessibility, surprisingly, the game plays really well with a controller as well. Could you explain the methodology behind adapting the game for a controller? I'm actually quite a big fan of that because not everybody's in a position to own a big sim rig or has the space for a steering wheel, and yet here I could still play a simulation-focused title with a controller. Yeah,
definitely. That was one of the things that was front of my mind, at least initially, when I first started the studio, was that we shouldn't try and limit ourselves to people who might not have the budget to get a high-end steering wheel, and certainly the lower end is not that cheap either. So I implemented a blanket rule for everyone at the studio working on KartKraft that we must play it with a controller. And
that's great.
With the exception of the physics development, I did all of my development with a controller and made sure it was fun and certainly able to express yourself and put the kart exactly where you want it using a controller. Where typically, if you started with a steering wheel to do that and then tried to almost retrofit the controller handling back into it, I don't think the result would be the same.
No, it definitely shows that proper thought and consideration has been taken into account for all players who have a PC. I guess the natural thing to ask about the game next would be, what's the roadmap coming soon? At some point the game will have to leave early access, if that's fair. So where are you? How are things going in that regard?
Yeah, for sure. We've had a roadmap, which was at least a target, if not a moving target, that gradually got pushed out for some of the releases. I can say it is. I can say that the next releases, and not particularly in this order, but we will be focusing on wet weather, releasing the long-awaited Genk, which was Max Verstappen's home circuit, where he honed his racecraft in a go-kart. And then the big ticket item is multiplayer, which we're working on now.
Yeah, wet multiplayer would be pretty special, I think.
Yep.
So just quickly on that then, any specific challenges to developing or adding wet weather to the game?
No, not
Is it
particularly.
progressing well?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things with wet weather and wet weather driving in karting is it's so different to what you typically see in in Formula One or a NASCAR, which doesn't even race in the wet. So a kart, when you're driving it, you typically stay off the racing line in the wet, and all of the grip is found off the driving line. And so because of the physics, because of the way we built the handling model from first principles, wet weather is merely just a matter of dialing down the friction coefficients for the surface, and then a little bit of water modeling and fluid dynamics for puddles. But the end result is it doesn't take much if you've got a truly authentic physics model under powering the whole game.
Right. Okay. So you start off with a physics model, and then you can build upon that. So you mentioned it briefly then. So just to clarify, in the wet, I'll be able to take the more sort of traditional karting wet lines. Is that fair? Because if so, that's really quite cool, and another thing that's not seen too often in racing games.
Yeah, for sure. So typically when you're coming into a corner, you'd be braking off the racing line, so closer to the middle of the circuit, waiting until you cross that line right until the last minute, and then literally turning in fully and cranking on as much steering lock as you possibly can to get that car to hook in and turn around. So it's quite unique to karting itself, but I think it'd be pretty incredible to watch this in a wet weather race with 30 other karts around you.
I really can't wait to try that. And just touching quickly on the online multiplayer aspects, are there any specific goals and ambitions? Dare I mention esports? Or is that much further down the line?
I think it's closer than what most people would realize. We launched a beta or a private beta of the multiplayer in KartKraft last year to a select few number of players, and that was really to test our back-end infrastructure to make sure that we the scheduled racing is working, that our matchmaking systems and algorithms are working correctly, and that was a largely a successful test. We're now focusing our efforts on building the prediction code, or improving the prediction code rather, improving the collision code, so that when we do launch it, it's a fully fledged online racing experience where there aren't any issues with lag and issues with, did that person really pump me off the track, or was that just a netcode?
Yeah, I think that's a challenging thing for many games to actually work out. So I'm glad that you've had a beta in some form beforehand, and it sounds like it's progressing well. I guess would there be like public lobbies and private lobbies? Can I just play with some friends, or is there what's the infrastructure like for the player in terms of online?
Yeah, the initial release that we'll put out will have just scheduled racing only, so that will be service hosted by ourselves. It's certainly something that we're looking at because of the feedback that we've received from the community, to having a look at private hosting, or whether they can rent a server or whether they create their own dedicated servers. So we're currently evaluating that internally, and we'll make an announcement once a decision's been made.
Following the acquisition, I think some of the fans of the game might be interested to know, does this shore up the development of KartKraft, and KartKraft will remain on its same path, but it just has now the additional resources to complete the vision?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the most exciting thing with this acquisition is we do have access to that talent, to the resources, which we previously didn't. One, to complete the initial roadmap for early access. Two, to extend that, and to invest into areas that previously we might not have had the resources to. So we're certainly very excited about where KartKraft's heading. It's not going to change as far as the core simulation experience that it currently is, but we're certainly looking to do things which might, one, expand the market for KartKraft and allow other players on different platforms, whether that be Xbox or PlayStation, to experience KartKraft. And one, to improve the accessibility of it. So we're not going to be producing a simcade version of KartKraft. We're not going to dial down the physics at all. I think is always a concern when you hear of talks like this. but we'd be adding more assists so that that players who are new to karting, can experience what it's like without going off the track and every 2 seconds.
So so to be clear, then we can all rest easy. It's not going to turn into Mario Kart anytime soon, but at the same time, there's going to be some elements there to help players who are new to it. And then also you mentioned consoles as well, which for me is really exciting, especially in terms of getting more people to play the game and experience these amazing physics. So just on those points, just quickly, in terms of assists, how are you finding adding those to the game, or is that something you're going to be looking at once like online and wet weather has been released?
Yeah, I think that the two critical assists are one, the some form of anti-lock braking system, where you can drive into a corner and know that you're not going to spin out, because brakes in a kart can be touchy, particularly having got that seat of the pants feel. And secondly, for a lot of people where they haven't driven a kart before, I think the thing that shocks people the most is just how little steering input's required to turn around the corner. And so we're looking at those assists, at least initially, to try and make it a little bit more accessible for people. Not dialing down the physics at all, but just making sure that when a new person comes in, they can enjoy the experience as much as a hardcore simulation enthusiast.
That's great. Yeah. So you would never want to force those onto users as well. Like they can turn them off, and then they just end up with the same experience as it is. That's very pleasing to hear. And then I guess just quickly then on the console side of things, is that something you've already started to work on, or if not, is that something you'd be working on relatively soon?
Yeah, it's not our current focus. Our current focus is to polish the PC version of KartKraft and finish what we started, and give our players a highly polished karting experience. But certainly it's something that we're evaluating internally, whether we take KartKraft to console. It's certainly been one of my goals for a long time to take it there. So I'd watch this space.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to focus on the current PC iteration and the early access and all those features first before looking at consoles. That sounds like a good approach. So being part of the Motorsport Games family, so to speak, now, they recently announced, big moves in terms of the intention to buy rFactor 2. They've got the 24-hour Le Mans or the British Touring Car licenses. So how does it feel to be sort of near those licenses and partnerships, and will you potentially be working on some in the future? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly exciting with the acquisitions and the recent news to acquire rFactor 2. And certainly I think it's every racing game fan's dream to be working on some of those licenses, whether it be BTCC, Le Mans, NASCAR. It's not something that we've discussed yet, but something I definitely wouldn't be turning down the opportunity to work on those licenses. And I think it's a testament to the caliber and the skill level of those working within Motorsport Games, that we've been able to secure licenses like that so quickly, and certainly something that I'm very excited to be a part of. That's
cool. Well, that just about wraps up everything I was going to ask. Zach, thank you very much for your time. I hope it's been okay. And it's really enjoyable to play KartKraft, so I can't wait to try the wet weather and the online and the additional tracks that are coming soon that you mentioned. Fingers crossed for a PlayStation version from my side as well. And just wish you all the best with this new venture.
Thank you very much, and it's been my pleasure, Tom.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks very much, Zach.
See you later.
See ya.